One of the best times of the year is almost upon us. Hockey is almost back. And what better way to start out than overhyping some of our prospects in the Penticton Young Stars Classic? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, we are once again doing my favorite thing of overhyping Jets prospects. Who doesn't love talking about the future? If we're being honest, I think the future has kind of been at the forefront of Winnipeg's thought processes because, well, the present, there's not been a lot of acquisitions or trades in the usual sense. You had some extensions. You had a couple of potential depth free agents brought in, but for the most part, it was more about an exodus of talent than it was an acquisition, which is fine, right? Sometimes you have to bleed to build, and I think that's kind of the sort of thought process the Jets have had for the most part this offseason, which I think is setting themselves up for a brighter, hopefully more internally developed future. But in the meantime, of course, the Penticton Young Stars Classic roster has finally been unveiled along with the schedule. It kicks off next week. We'll talk more specifically about the Young Stars Classic and what to expect in those 4 games or 5 games next week later this episode. But for the Jets, right, let's start off with the roster in just a moment. Before we dive into who's on this roster and why it should be of interest to y'all, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I said, the Young Stars Classic roster, we're going to start in net. Thomas Milic and Dominic DiVincentis are both returning for Winnipeg once again. Obviously, DiVincentis, I think, probably had a little bit of a step back this past season. I think that there was some disappointment in his overall record and numbers. Record-wise, I mean, it was pretty good, but if you look at the save percentage and the goals against average, which I don't personally love GAA, but it is a stat that people rely upon, you do notice that it's significantly higher than it was when I think he won Goalie of the Year. So obviously, bit of a rough season this past year for him. At least their offense and stuff still held up, and he was still able to put together, a 27-9-4 record. But behind that, the stats were a little bit rougher. Milic, I think, has kind of become Winnipeg's front-running goalie prospect, and this is all relative, right? You're looking at, around a 900 to 908 save percentage, depending on which of the pro leagues he's been playing in. For Norfolk, he had a 908. With the Moose, he had a 900, and his record has generally been solid for both teams. I think the biggest takeaway is that, both of these guys at some point could become something for the Jets, but I would expect that the best you see out of either Milic or DiVincentis is a backup, which that's great, right? If either of them becomes a backup, that's a home run pick. You really cannot be upset with either of those guys turning out to be some pro level of players. So if either of them do make the cut and eventually reach the NHL and actually have a level of success, that for me is pretty darn fantastic. On the defensive side of things, the Jets are dressing and bringing in 7 guys, including a couple of folks who are relatively new arrivals. We've got some returning friends like Elias Salamonson, Dmitry Kuzmin, and then, of course, some of you are familiar with Dylan Anhorn, who was a free agent that came in last year. Will be interesting to see him in a full season for the Moose. He's kind of like a free prospect of sorts, if you will, and I'm hoping that he can become maybe at some point a third pairing kind of guy for the Jets. Otherwise, you've got, a local fella, Ben Zloty, who I believe was playing for the Ice for a bit. You've also got Graham Sword and Darson Barteau, and then Hunter Mayo. Mayo could actually be an interesting pro-level defender at some point, maybe for the Moose. We'll have to see. What I like about these groups is that they tend to invite some guys with some decent puck moving ability, and I think that's a skill that for both the Jets and the Moose, they certainly could do with more of in their system. So, don't mind some camp invitees. Love to see some of the young kids get a chance, and maybe one of them or two of them becomes worth your time and investment as a pro-level defender. Now, on the forward side, Winnipeg is bringing 17 names in. Braden Yager will get his first real reps for the Jets, system, you might say. Then you've got Daniel Torgerson, who's also, of course, a bit of a mainstay for the Moose. I hope that this year is better for him. Last year was a little underwhelming for what I expected, but, he's still got potential to become something as a depth player for the Jets in the future. We'll also get the first real glimpse of Kevin He in a Jets uniform, I guess. He obviously is still a little bit of ways away, probably a couple of years of seasoning required, but, he's got a relentless motor. Maybe he improves really quickly. He's still very young, so it's exciting for him. I'm sure that the Jets are hoping that he could become a really solid middle six contributor, and he certainly has the motor to match. We'll also, of course, be welcoming back Colby Barlow. Barlow, for me, I think maybe didn't have the massive jump this past season that he was hoping for, but in a few games with the Moose, he did record a couple of points. This is going to be an interesting year of development and growth for him. Can he add that extra layer of skill to his game that's going to separate him from the pack? As we go further down, I might start to speed up the names just a little bit because it is a relatively long list. Of course, we're going to see Chaz, our good old friend, who really has had the worst injury luck. If there's anyone I'm really rooting for to kind of go the Velarde route, it's probably Lucius. He could be a real big sleeper prospect for the Jets, but until he actually plays a full season, it is hard to really read too much into his performance so far. Danny Zhulkin, of course, is also coming back. Had a bit of a patchy season in his first pro year. Injuries and, of course, some offensive underperformance and growing pains, all of what you would expect at the pro levels. Hopefully this season is a little bit more successful for him. We're also going to see Markus Lopone. Lopone, of course, is coming over from Finland. I haven't really gotten a fair read on his game yet, and I certainly don't want to write him off. I think the original footage that I saw didn't really stand out, but maybe Lopone has something that the scouts are really after. So I'll reserve judgment until we can see him a little bit closer. Connor Levis, Kieran Walton, and, of course, Jacob Julian are all coming in. Julian and Levis are returning, and Walton, of course, is our brand new addition. I would be interested to see how Julian and Walton do. Levis is also another center with some, legit distribution skill. And, of course, Julian and Walton are on the bigger side. So maybe one of these guys could become a bit of an Adam Lowry heir apparent at some point. Further you go, you're starting to see some of the more invite types. You've got Carson Golder, Ben King, Mark Lewinsky, and Luke Mistelbacher supplementing our two standouts in Triberkov and Lambert. We both expect that Lambert and Triberkov probably make the Jets this year. Remains to be seen in what role. Can't say I'm familiar too much with some of the other camp invitees. I think Golder had a pretty decent stint with the Moose recently, although he didn't have like a huge scoring record. But Ben King supposedly has some decent hype as a solid middle six contributor for the Gulls. So maybe he'll be able to help be one of those big free agent acquisitions for Manitoba's top six. Other than that, you're going to see a couple of guys who have maybe had a cup of tea with the Moose or another pro org. But either way, I think you're seeing a lot of familiar names in the system, which, not the worst, right? Couple of new names. Yager will be interesting to see. He would be fun. I'm hoping for big things from Walton. But otherwise, it's going to be a relatively, familiar group, if you want to phrase it that way. Now, as far as, what the schedule looks like, we're going to get into that in just a quick moment. Before we get ahead of ourselves, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. When it comes to passion, drive, and patience, we all know that the formula for winning championships is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. It's just like building that perfect title contender, right? You've got to have the right mix, the right chemistry, and with a vehicle, you really can't afford to have parts that just don't fit. eBay Motors totally understands they've got a great selection of superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, they have you covered with a great selection of over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. And of course, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for because they also have eBay Guaranteed Fit, which means that part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting a little bit ahead of Winnipeg's upcoming fun prospect tournament. Obviously, it is the Penticton Young Stars Classic, and I think all of us have probably, to some degree, been awaiting the return of Jets hockey. This is not the usual Jets hockey, mind you, but it is a form of it. I know at this point I'll take just about anything. For once, I'm actually curious to see, Arneal do his thing. And the tournament, which is going to have 6 games, the Jets are going to be involved in 3 of them. It should be a good time. It starts next Friday. Again, I think I'm probably relatively excited for just something, right? Before we dive into talking a little bit about what I'm hoping to see and sort of what we might expect from this one, and again, it's just a preseason tournament. Let's not go, a little bit too crazy, but just wanted to say thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. While you're at it, you might want to make your second listen Locked On NHL. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, looking ahead, the Jets are actually going to open the Young Stars Classic on Friday with a game against the Calgary Flames, or I guess the babyish Flames, if you want to talk about it in those terms. I think for Winnipeg at this point, this is going to be a good chance for some of the kids to first get reps with this org. I look at Walton, he and some of the others who haven't been to one of these before, who haven't really even had a lot of training and practice time with the Jets. Obviously, a lot of these kids are going back to junior, or in some cases, maybe 1 or 2 is going to get a Moose deal if they're eligible. But for the most part, these guys are probably a little further off. He, brand new addition to the Jets pool. Obviously, I'm excited for him as a half Asian myself. It's exciting that we have an Asian-born player on this roster. That's awesome. But in terms of the actual player, he is a fire spark of offense. He's been very fun for Niagara. He doesn't quite have the points totals that tell you he's going to be a top 6 talent necessarily, but I think in terms of a guy, if you're looking for good skating, good speed, and a really well-balanced tool set that probably projects to be some level of impact NHLer, even if it's in a depth role, he, I think, is going to stand out, and I think he's going to be a natural leader for this team. Walton, Julian, guys like those, I think that they'll anchor Winnipeg's middle depth, and hopefully, at least one of these guys becomes a Lowry replacement. All of them, for the most part, are fairly big, and they all have really nice skill. Walton especially has some Tage Thompson stuff that I've seen in him. Obviously still very raw, and it's more stylistic than it is output. Thompson is obviously one of Buffalo's best players, so let's not get ahead of ourselves and anoint Walton the next Tage Thompson. Tage's growth, to be honest, is already very strange as it is. He is a fairly unique player, even amongst many NHLers, especially when you look at his development track. So comparing anyone to him is obviously not really a one-to-one analog, and I certainly don't think Walton is going to have quite that level of offensive output. But if he somehow does, wow, would that be pretty dang sick. Otherwise, I think for the rest of the Jets roster, I'm kind of hoping to see Winnipeg get a little bit faster on the back end. I think that that's something that has maybe been a little bit of a challenge over the past few years. I think guys like Kuzman and Salamonson are at some point going to see minutes for the Jets. Salamonson especially. Kuzman's a little bit more of a longer shot, but he's already playing for the Moose a bit. He's had some games with the Ads. Either way, I suspect he'll be some sort of a role player for Winnipeg's pro system at some point. Otherwise, I think we'll see some of the new kids, and we'll also see some of our returning pros, guys who are either playing in the AHL or something equivalent already, and are perhaps looking to make a case for Winnipeg's roster. I think most of the veterans like Torgerson, Lambert, Chibrikov, those guys are going to feature in preseason at some point. I guess the biggest question is, what are they going to, do during this tournament? Are they going to play a lot? Are they going to be relied upon a lot? It's not like these rosters are all that big, so you're likely to see at least a game or two for most of these kids. But otherwise, I don't know that I'm expecting anything crazy from these teams. Winnipeg's Young Stars group usually loses. That's kind of been a trend the last few years. I think this roster is actually pretty strong, relatively speaking, because there's actually quite a few pro-level, pro-grade players who have already had reps in some capacity. For Lambert, of course, this is going to be probably one of the easiest levels of competition he's faced recently. So they may not play him a ton if they're trying to avoid any injuries, but I'd expect him to be a pretty big part of the top six if they do want him to warm up quickly and stuff. Am I really expecting anything crazy here? No, I wouldn't say that. I don't really judge these tournaments all that closely. This is just kind of like an appetizer, if you will, before preseason, which in and of itself is also an appetizer. It's kind of like a little bowl of nuts before your actual food starts to arrive. So if you view it from that perspective, it's a fun, cool first opportunity to see some of the young players and some of our future Jets. How many of these guys are actually going to project into pro roles is harder to say, but if you watched our recent episode on Will Scouch's rankings, you know that a number of these prospects actually rank relatively highly on his pyramid of prospects. Maybe not by your standards, maybe you're not really seeing a lot of high-end talents, but if you get more than a handful of NHL pros out of this, you're really, really happy, right? You've already got a couple of guys who have played NHL games in this lineup, at least one or so, and you have a number of other players who are likely to play for the Jets at some point in the near or distant future. So, I'm guessing I'm probably going to keep a close eye on some of the camp invites. I'd really like to see Dylan Anhorn and what he looks like with a few more games with the Moose this season. I'd like to see what he can bring to camp because he is one of those, I would say, contenders for a depth spot as like a seventh D at some point in the future. Maybe not this year, but perhaps in the future. Maybe he'll even make a role for himself on the third pairing in the subsequent seasons. I'm also curious about Lopone. Lopone is one of those players that I just don't know that much about. There's not a lot of footage out there. The footage that was available didn't really make him seem like an offensive tour de force, but surely if the Jets drafted him, they saw some sort of hidden potential. So would be really interesting to see what his time is like, and he'll be spending this year in North America. So hopefully, I forget which team he's been signed with, but hopefully it goes well in North America. Hopefully he adapts, and it'll be interesting to see if he's got an extra level to his game that he has yet to show. If there's guys who I think are really fighting for, their future pro careers, I might look at Henry Nikkanen as one of them. Nikkanen hasn't really taken off the way that I think a lot of folks, perhaps expected. Not that I projected him to be a really high scoring forward, but I did kind of think he'd have a little more offensive success at the Moose level. So far, it's been pretty modest, and maybe that's just a reality as he's, a middle six player at the Moose level. Maybe he's a fourth liner at the NHL level. That might be what he tops off at, which is fine, right? More skill and more, depth for the Moose is certainly not a problem, but I think if you're projecting him to do much more than that at this stage, probably not. He's like getting closer to 24 at this stage. I think he might be a fine pro player, but maybe just not a high-end NHLer. But this year is a chance for him to perhaps turn that perception around. Maybe this is the time for him to really impress. We'll just have to wait and see. He might feature a bit in preseason, but I guess it may depend on what he does with the Young Stars Classic, right? There's lots of guys competing for minutes in preseason and in camp, and I think Nikkanen at this point is probably more on the fringes of this organization than he is at the forefront of Winnipeg's rosters. So, I'm wishing him the best of luck. He's got some competition, I'll tell you that. You've got young guys who are going to be coming here to the pros in just a year or two. Levis, Julian, Walton. Levis, I think, has already, got a couple of games for the Moose. So, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of roster spots despite, Manitoba maybe not having as much high-end talent as it's had in past seasons. So all that to say, it's just nice to have hockey kind of sort of back into form. Again, don't read a ton into these preseason kind of tournament thingies. The Young Stars Classic is not normal hockey. It's not a usual game, but it is a fun little sort of teaser for the future. And maybe that's all we just need, a little bit of a taste before preseason starts in the weeks after. So, man, we're counting down. It's not that far off from October. Start of the season will be here before you know it. And then we finally get Jets hockey back in earnest. But amidst all of this, there's still one player the Jets have yet to re-sign. And if it, any indication is to go by his recent appearance for training and practice, we might be nearing a deal sooner than later, which the Jets Twitter account will probably appreciate. I keep spamming their account asking for an announcement jokingly, but also not really joking. I would love to hear about a Perfetti extension sooner rather than later. But of course, we'll talk about what Perfetti's appearance and what he's up to may suggest about his future with the Jets in just a moment. Before we go too much further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Game Time. Game Time is for all of you who are, really tired of wasting time and money on tickets. A lot of you have probably used other services and you've spent a lot of money because you get hit with surprise pricing, lots of hidden fees, things that just really piss you off. And look, as somebody who's bought plenty of tickets myself, I get it. I'm in the same boat. It's annoying as heck and nobody likes it, right? Game Time is here to help, and they even have a brand new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time knows you don't want to waste time and have to go through all sorts of stuff. They want to give you the best tickets, the best seats, the best deals up front. And of course, if you turn in all-in pricing in these settings, you can check the immediate out-of-pocket cost and make sure that you're not getting hit with surprise fees when you're looking for that hot new concert or sports ticket. Of course, the Jets games are coming up this upcoming season. Game Time can help you get to the game cheaper, especially, with their lowering prices as it gets closer to puck drop. That's a great option. And again, if you just want to see the price up front, just click on all-in pricing. It shows you the total up front. There's no surprises at checkout. And of course, for somebody like me who buys Oriole tickets, I can personally attest to the fact that Game Time is super easy. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, go with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Greetings, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's closing thoughts as we're just, we're starting to talk about perhaps a looming Winnipeg Jets Cole Perfetti contract extension announcement. Perfetti was actually practicing recently, and in fact, he showed up. He's taking full reps. He's doing all the stuff that he wants, and this is... interesting that it's been pointed out because obviously McGroarty wouldn't want to show up at camp and all that fun stuff. So, I think you can kind of tell that, perhaps Perfetti's attitude towards being a Winnipeg Jet is a little bit different than some of the others that have decided to take a hike. But Perfetti, he's joining the Jets on the NHL media tour. I think Winnipeg is basically signaling that Perfetti really is one of those core pieces of the team. Scott Billick reported recently, actually earlier today, that, Perfetti does want to be a Jet. He is open to a long-term deal. And I think that you're seeing him show up for camp and show up and doing, training and skate stuff, that he's joining the media tour. He's not worried about an extension at all. If anything, I think it actually suggests that he's already got a short-term thing worked out, and now it's just figuring out if there's perhaps a signing to be made in the long term. And with all these players locking in at like 6+ years, most of them towards the 8 end of that spectrum, I actually wonder if the Jets have a big long-term offer that's a reasonable amount of money. Now, I think for both parties, it's a little challenging to figure out how much you really want to pay Perfetti for a long-term deal, just because he doesn't have a lot of substantiating evidence on the surface to lock in, via his agent, right? And that may have made negotiations a little bit challenging, but I think if you sign him up now, you're not going to regret locking up a guy who's going to be a core piece for this team for many, many years. It gives you cost certainty, it gives you cost control, and it helps you map out your timeline for the future and ultimately need, like what you're trying to figure out for roster needs. And so I think that this could be a really good deal for the Jets. I think Perfetti locked up long-term is a real possibility. The fact that Cole is doing all of this stuff already and just being a great consummate professional, and we've already heard the rumors that he's okay with signing long-term with the Jets. I think it's all pushing towards a big announcement here sometime in the very near future, maybe as soon as next week. I think that this is not going to be an issue for much longer. I'm personally excited. I wouldn't be shocked if this is a bigger deal than a bridge. If it does end up being a bridge, I get it, right? I think from both sides, I understand that perhaps it's maybe just a little bit too soon for Perfetti to perhaps give up some of the negotiating leverage. Maybe he wants to bet on himself a little bit more. Maybe he wants to see how Arniel uses him before he locks in with this franchise for the foreseeable prime of his career. But all that said, I'm not really sweating it. I think this just shows that they're much further along than perhaps some people have suggested. That whole thing about Perfetti being part of the trade package for Neat just weeks ago, I just didn't really believe. I don't think it really should have been given much merit. I think Perfetti is, one of those guys that the Jets not necessarily want to build around in the usual sense, but he's a core piece for the future and present. So all I can say is you sign him up for a big year this season. He stays healthy. He has a monster year. That contract is going to look like one of the best decisions the Jets have ever made. I've always been a big fan of him ever since he was drafted. It's just been, lights out excitement for me. I know I joked about overhyping players. I've probably overhyped Perfetti several times throughout my life already. And I'm ready to do it again for what I think is going to be a big season from him. I wouldn't be shocked if he has 50 to 60 points this year and starts to look more and more like an elite piece of this top six. So get excited. I think that contract extension is in the pipes. I think it's coming sooner than later. I'm excited. I think a lot of you should be excited. And if you're perhaps wondering why you should be, well, just look at his 5v5 scoring rates and how it compares to the rest of the team. He's up there with guys like Scheifele, Connor, Ehlers, the usual names, and he's barely played more than third or fourth line minutes already in his career. So we got that deal done. Arniel starts to use him much more this year, and all I can say is I am excited for his future and for the Jets' future. But let me know what you're expecting in his contract. I'm going to go out and say if it's like a 7 or an 8 year deal, $7.5 million, maybe in that range. I think that would actually be pretty fair. I think it gives him some room. I think it gives the Jets a reasonably good cost-controlled amount. The cap hit with the cap going up is not going to be that crazy. And I think he's going to be worth every single penny of that deal. So get excited. Give me your contract predictions in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here for another special weekend episode. So see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.